An old truck, a quiet man, and a lie that lasted over a decade. A lie so small it almost went unnoticed, until one day it threatened to take away the only thing he had left. But sometimes even the quietest people have a line they refuse to let others cross. Boulder, Colorado, winter 2022. Snow lay in thin blankets over the lawns and rooftops of a sleepy little neighborhood nestled near the base of the Flatirons. Most homes here belong to retirees, the kind of folks who still waved at the mailman and left porch lights on for visiting grandkids. And then there was Thomas Burke. At 68 years old, Thomas lived alone in the same modest house he had shared with his late wife for over 3 decades. A former Army mechanic turned community handyman, he was the type of man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. His days were quiet, morning coffee on the porch, tending to his small garden, and caring for the one thing he still treasured above all, a faded 1995 Ford F-150 pickup truck. To anyone else, it might have looked like just an old vehicle past its prime, but to Thomas, it was memory made metal. The truck he and his wife had bought the summer before her diagnosis, the one they'd taken cross-country on their last real adventure together. It hadn't moved in a while, but it wasn't abandoned. It was sacred. That's why, when Thomas found a neon orange violation sticker slapped across the windshield one cold morning, warning that the truck would be towed for being unsightly and unmoved, something in him shifted. It wasn't just a sticker, it was a line crossed. And whoever crossed it, they had no idea who they were messing with. Thomas didn't get angry easily. Years in the Army had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, and years after that taught him that most things in life weren't worth raising your voice over. But as he stood there in the cold morning light, staring at that orange sticker plastered across the windshield of his old Ford, something in his chest stirred. It wasn't rage. It was something quieter, deeper, something like betrayal. He peeled the sticker off carefully, his weathered hands steady. He read every word slowly, like it was a letter from another world. Vehicle marked as abandoned, subject to removal within 5 days under HOA guidelines. Abandoned? This truck had been with him longer than most people in his life. It had been with him through hospital visits, long drives to nowhere, and quiet afternoons when he missed her too much to stay inside. It wasn't abandoned. It was anchored. Later that afternoon, he walked down the street to Lot 23, the new 2-story house with the modern windows and shiny black Tesla out front. He knocked. A man in his early 30s opened the door, dressed in joggers and a smartwatch, holding a protein shake like it was part of his hand. "Can I help you?" the man asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "I think you're the one who filed the complaint about my truck." "Oh," the man smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's nothing personal, just trying to keep the neighborhood looking sharp, you know?" Thomas blinked. "She's not hurting anyone." "I get it," the man said, shrugging. "It's sentimental, but from the sidewalk it just kind of drags down the aesthetic." Aesthetic. Thomas hated that word. The man held out his hand. "I'm Elliot, by the way. New to the neighborhood. I work in real estate. Let me know if you're ever thinking about selling." Thomas didn't shake his hand. Instead, he just said, "That truck's not going anywhere," and turned around. But something about that conversation sat wrong with him. It wasn't just the sticker. It wasn't even the smugness. It was the way Elliot had looked past him, past the man and straight to the property behind him, like Thomas was already a footnote in someone else's future plan. That night, Thomas sat by his window, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, and watched Elliot's porch lights flicker on one by one, like stars in a sky he didn't trust. There's a particular kind of silence that comes before a storm, and Thomas Burke, calm, patient, always polite, was about to find out what happens when someone tries to take away the last piece of a life he'd already lost once. Thomas didn't sleep that night. Not really. He dozed off and on, but his mind kept drifting. Not to the orange sticker or Elliot's fake smile, but to a feeling he hadn't known in years. Displacement. That was the word for it, like he didn't belong anymore in the very place he had poured his life into. The next morning, while clearing out a drawer in the garage, not out of purpose, but out of restless habit, He stumbled on an old wooden cigar box, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed maps and spare screws. He hadn't opened it in a long time. Inside were folded letters, dog tags, photos of a younger version of himself standing in desert heat, arms slung over the shoulder of a kid barely 20, laughing like the war was just a game of survival. That kid was Private First Class Harold Crane. Thomas sat down hard on the stool beside the workbench. Harold, always joking, always scribbling in that little notebook he kept in his breast pocket. They'd shared more in 6 months overseas than some brothers do in a lifetime. And then Harold had caught shrapnel during a roadside explosion. He made it home, barely. Thomas had stayed with him through the surgery, through rehab, through nightmares neither of them talked about. The last thing Harold ever sent Thomas was a letter, a thank you written in shaking ink, and a photo of his newborn son. "His name's Elliot," the letter said. "I hope he grows up with your heart." Thomas froze. The name hit him like cold water. Elliot, the same Elliot who now lived across the street, sipping protein shakes and talking about aesthetics. That smug little man was Harold's son, and he had no idea. Or maybe worse, he did know and didn't care. Thomas felt a cold fury rise in his chest, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that boils slow, thick with disappointment. This boy, this man, would not exist if Thomas hadn't pulled his father out of that Humvee. And now he wanted to erase him from his own neighborhood? He held the photo up to the light. Harold in a wheelchair, holding infant Elliot. It was him, no question. For a long time, Thomas said nothing. Just sat there, elbows on his knees, the weight of memory pressing down like the Colorado snow outside. That afternoon, he wrote one thing on a notepad. Just a name, underlined twice, Elliot Crane. Then he opened his file cabinet. He wasn't going to fight dirty, but he was going to fight, because sometimes injustice doesn't come with sirens or fists. Sometimes it comes wearing cologne, smiling too wide, and thinking a quiet man won't stand up. Elliot was about to learn just how wrong he was. It took Thomas 3 days to decide whether he would say anything at all. Some part of him, the tired part, thought it wasn't worth it. Let the boy win. Let him have his perfect lawn, his silent streets, his symmetrical life. But every time he passed that truck in the driveway, every time he saw the shine of that chrome grill catching the morning sun, he remembered Harold, and how a man's legacy should never be buried under real estate deals and shallow smiles. So on Sunday morning, when the world was quiet and Elliot was trimming his hedges in workout gear, Thomas crossed the lawn with a folder in his hand. "Morning," Elliot said, glancing up. Thomas didn't respond, just handed him the folder. Inside was the letter, the photo, the proof. Elliot's eyes scanned the paper, at first with confusion, then discomfort, and then disbelief. "That's my dad," he said, voice low. Thomas nodded once. "You knew him?" "I saved him," Thomas replied. "Pulled him out of a Humvee that was burning from the inside. Held him down while the medic worked. Slept next to his hospital bed for 3 nights after they shipped him home." Elliot was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know," he muttered. "No," Thomas said. "You didn't ask." There was no anger in his voice, just weight. Elliot cleared his throat, defensive now. "Look, I wasn't trying to disrespect." "You didn't think twice," Thomas cut in gently. "You saw something that didn't fit your image, and you tried to erase it. Just like that." Elliot looked away. Thomas continued. "That truck? It's the last thing my wife and I bought together. We drove it through the Rockies one fall, singing along to songs we forgot years ago. It sat outside the hospital when she took her last breath. Silence settled over them, thick like morning fog. I'm not asking for pity," Thomas added. "I'm asking for space, for dignity. You're not the first man who's tried to take that from me, but you might be the last." Elliot said nothing. Thomas turned to walk back, but before he reached his porch, he paused. "One more thing," he said over his shoulder. "Your father had your face, but not your heart." And with that, he stepped inside. Sometimes a conversation isn't a fight. Sometimes it's a mirror. And Elliot Crane had just seen a reflection he didn't expect, and maybe couldn't forget. In the days that followed their conversation, Thomas expected the cold shoulder. But Elliot didn't avoid him. He didn't come knocking either. He simply changed. The morning jog slowed. The loud phone calls on the porch stopped. And for the first time since he moved in, Elliot no longer looked past Thomas when they crossed paths. He looked at him. It wasn't apology, but it was something. Still, Thomas wasn't waiting on redemption. He had lived long enough to know that closure doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it shows up in silence, in the way a man chooses not to repeat his mistakes. But the neighborhood had been watching too. And then one morning, they showed up. Mrs. Hadley from 3 doors down brought lemon bread and a folded note. The retired couple from the corner brought over their grandkids, who waved shyly and asked about the truck from the war. Even old Mr. Kessler, who hadn't spoken more than a grunt in years, handed Thomas a fresh bottle of polish and muttered, "She deserves to shine again." They weren't there just for the truck. They were there for him. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. You matter. You're seen. You stood your ground, and we're standing with you. They worked on the truck all afternoon, repainted the faded trim, replaced the mirrors, cleaned the interior with careful hands. And when the sun dipped low behind the Rockies, that old Ford looked like a memory brought back to life. Thomas stood on the porch, arms crossed, heart full. "She's beautiful," someone whispered. "No," Thomas said quietly. "She's home." 2 days later, a for sale sign appeared on Elliot's lawn. No announcements, no explanations. Just one more lesson about how some things, respect, dignity, legacy, can't be bought or outvoted. That Sunday, Thomas sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee, watching birds flutter around the feeder. The street was quiet again, but not hollow. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when things have finally settled where they belong. And when a young boy rode by on his bike and yelled, "Mister, that's a cool truck," Thomas smiled wide, eyes soft. "Thanks, son," he said, and meant every word. A week after the for sale sign went up on Elliot's lawn, a strange calm returned to the neighborhood. But calm doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means people are finally exhaling, after holding their breath for too long. Thomas spent his mornings like he always had. Black coffee, old vinyl records, a crossword half solved beside his recliner. But something was different now. He could feel it. The glances from neighbors lasted longer. The greetings felt warmer. And on more than one occasion, someone stopped by just to say, "We should have spoken up sooner." One afternoon, as Thomas was dusting off an old shelf in the garage, he found something tucked behind a box of oil rags. An old wooden plaque, buried under years of dust and time. He had almost forgotten it existed. Burke Auto, honest repairs since '78. The sign had once hung proudly outside his shop, a place he'd built from scratch after leaving the military, a place where people came not just for repairs, but for respect. He ran a finger across the carved letters. So many names, faces, memories lived in that grain. And maybe it was time, he thought, not to rebuild the shop, but to remember the man who did. That night, he mounted the sign above the truck in the garage, not for anyone else, just for himself. A quiet reminder. You were never small. They just tried to make you feel that way. A few days later, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the street, a boy rode up to Thomas's driveway again, the same one who had shouted, "Cool truck," a week before. This time he stopped. "Sir?" the boy asked, nervous but curious. "Is that your truck? The old one?" Thomas chuckled. "She is. Been with me longer than most people I know." The boy nodded, eyes wide. "My dad says old stuff's just junk. Says people need to move on." Thomas looked at the boy for a long second, then walked to the truck and tapped the hood gently. "Your dad's not entirely wrong," he said. "Sometimes we do have to move on, but sometimes the old stuff is what reminds us who we are." The boy tilted his head. "Like memories?" "Exactly," Thomas said with a small smile. "Or love, or promises." The boy looked at the truck like it had just told him a secret. Then he looked back at Thomas. "I think I get it." Thomas handed him a soft cloth from the bench. "Then help me keep her shining, would you?" And just like that, the boy began polishing the fender. Careful, deliberate, like it mattered. And maybe that's how healing happens. Not with speeches or shouting, but with small hands, shared stories, and the quiet work of remembering what truly matters. Weeks passed. The for sale sign on Elliot's lawn turned into a moving truck, then an empty driveway, then silence. Just like that, he was gone. No goodbyes, no flyers, no final remarks. Only the echo of a man who had come into the neighborhood with ambition and left with something heavier, the weight of perspective. But Thomas didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. Victory wasn't in someone else leaving. It was in choosing to stay true, to stay kind, to stay standing. His old Ford still sat in its rightful place, not sparkling like a showroom car, but honest in its aging, like Thomas himself, like the stories etched into the wood of his porch, like the way the sun caught the Burke Auto sign in just the right way each morning, as if it were blessing the past. And life moved on, but it moved better. Neighbors waved more often, people lingered on sidewalks, shared recipes again, talked about their kids, their aches, their gardens, and every now and then, a visitor would stop to ask about the truck. Thomas didn't always tell the full story, but when he did, he ended it the same way. Sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be true. Maybe you're listening to this story from your living room. Maybe you're in your car, maybe walking the dog, maybe sitting alone with a quiet coffee like Thomas once did. But wherever you are, you've felt it, haven't you? That moment where someone tried to tell you that who you are, what you carry, what you've lived, didn't matter. That your memories were just old stuff, that your place didn't count, that silence meant weakness. But now you know what Thomas knew. Silence, when chosen with intention, isn't weakness. It's strength dressed in patience. And dignity, it's never out of style. So if this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or maybe someone you used to be, don't let it stop here. Share it with a friend, a neighbor, someone who needs to be reminded that the quiet ones aren't invisible. They're unshakable. Have you ever had to reclaim your peace like Thomas did? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. Your story matters, and someone out there might need to hear it. If this story touched your heart, give it a like. And if you want more stories that honor real people, real dignity, and real courage, hit subscribe. Because in a world full of noise, we need more stories like this one. Ones that whisper truth, that echo strength, and that remind us, sometimes the greatest act of resistance is refusing to forget who you are. There are stories we hear, and then there are narrated stories we feel, the kind that stay with us long after the words have faded. The Old Truck and a Lie That Lasted 12 Years is exactly that kind of tale. More than just a conflict over a parking space or a rusted vehicle, it's a touching story about memory, integrity, and the quiet power of holding on to what truly matters. For many older Americans, this isn't just fiction, it's familiar. Because we've all known what it feels like to be overlooked, to be treated as if our time, our belongings, or even our presence somehow no longer matter. But Thomas Burke, with his calm manner and weathered truck, teaches us something profound. Justice doesn't always need a gavel. Sometimes it arrives in the form of patience that refuses to be dismissed. Lesson 1. Dignity doesn't fade with age. It deepens. In a world that seems to idolize youth and speed, Thomas reminds us that slowness is not weakness. His truck wasn't shiny, but it was sacred. It held a marriage, a lifetime of service, and love that refused to be erased by a sticker. When someone tried to make him feel small, he didn't shout. He stood taller, not with noise, but with truth. That's not just a justice story. That's a blueprint for how to live. Lesson 2. Memory is not clutter, it's legacy. Elliot saw an old vehicle. Thomas saw the last road trip with his wife, the final hospital parking lot, the years they built together. How often do we forget that things, old chairs, photo frames, handwritten letters, are anchors to identity, especially as we grow older? This story gently asks us, what have we held on to and why? It's what makes this such an incredible story, not because of dramatic plot twists, but because it honors the ordinary as sacred. Lesson 3. Silence can speak louder than anger. Thomas never raised his voice. He didn't rally a mob or write an angry blog. He simply told the truth. He showed Elliot a photo, a letter, a name, and in doing so, he made an entire community remember who he was and who they were too. That's the kind of heartwarming story that heals more than it hurts. So many unraveled fates in our world begin with someone being ignored, and end when that same someone quietly refuses to disappear. This isn't just another episode of feel-good fiction. It's part of a greater movement of narrated stories that uplift, honor, and respect the quiet resilience so many people carry. So if you felt something stir inside while listening to Thomas's journey, you're not alone. Maybe it reminded you of your father's old pickup. Maybe it echoed your own story, the one you've never quite told. Or maybe, just maybe, it reminded you that your voice, even if quiet, still matters. That is the power of a well-told tale. That is why we need more justice stories, more touching stories, more incredible stories that reflect not just what we hope to be, but who we already are. And more than anything, we need stories that whisper, you are not forgotten, you are not alone, and you are not done yet. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still carries their own quiet battles. Let's keep honoring the past, not as something to be tucked away, but as a light that still guides us forward.